Most killers get caught because they are sloppy. They leave fingerprints. They tell someone. They go back to the scene. They use their own phone. They park their own car outside the victim's house. They make the kind of mistake that comes from acting on impulse, from letting emotion override caution, from the basic human inability to stay completely invisible when you are doing something terrible. Israel Keyes did not make those mistakes. He did not act on impulse. He did not tell anyone. He did not use his phone or his car or his credit card anywhere near the places where he committed his crimes. He did not even live in the same part of the country as most of his victims. He planned his murders the way a military strategist plans an operation. Years in advance, with contingencies, with meticulous attention to every possible point of failure. He would travel to a remote area of the United States, sometimes thousands of miles from his home in Alaska. He would bury a container in the ground. Inside that container would be everything he needed: cash, zip ties, a firearm, supplies. He called these caches murder kits buried in the earth, waiting. Then he would go home. He would work his construction business. He would raise his daughter. He would be, by every visible measure, a normal man with a normal life. Years later, sometimes years, he would return. He would fly into a distant city, use cash whenever he could, rent a car far from the crime scene, and drive for hours or days before acting. He would drive hundreds of miles from the rental location, retrieve his buried cash, and select a victim. Not a specific person, a type, a situation, a house with a light on, or a house with a light off. A person who fit a pattern he had constructed in his own mind. Afterward, he would drive back, return the car, fly home, and go back to work. He appears to have done this, in different forms, for more than a decade. When FBI investigators eventually sat across from Israel Keyes in an interview room in Anchorage, Alaska, they were dealing with an offender who was unusually difficult to profile: patient, mobile, disciplined, and deliberate about separating his crimes from his ordinary life. A serial killer who had deliberately constructed his murders to be impossible to connect to each other, impossible to connect to him, and impossible to investigate using any of the standard forensic methods that law enforcement relied upon. He did not appear to follow one narrow victim type. He had no consistent geographic area. He had no simple public signature that tied his crimes together in any obvious way. He had no relationship to any of his victims. He chose them essentially at random, based on opportunity and on what he called the conditions being right. He had no social connections that would lead any investigator toward him. He was not perfect. The Samantha Koenig case would prove that. But investigators regarded him as one of the most methodical and difficult to connect serial offenders they had encountered. And then, in February of 2012, he kidnapped a young woman named Samantha Koenig from a coffee kiosk in Anchorage, Alaska. And he tried to collect a ransom. And the ransom demand led investigators to an ATM camera in Texas. And the ATM camera led them to a rental car. And the rental car led them to a man named Israel Keyes in a traffic stop in Lufkin, Texas. He had made one mistake. One visible thread after years of discipline. One was enough. This is the story of Israel Keyes. A man who built his crimes like an engineer builds a bridge. Carefully, deliberately, and with a disturbing attention to every possible weak point. A man who studied serial killers the way other people study hobbies, reading everything, analyzing patterns, identifying where others had failed, and ensuring he would not fail the same way. A man who, when he was finally caught, was simultaneously cooperative and terrifying, telling investigators enough to confirm his crimes while deliberately withholding enough to ensure that many of them would never be fully solved. Some of those cases are still open. Some of his possible victims may never be identified. Somewhere in the United States, there are people who disappeared and whose families have never received an answer. And one possible answer may be Israel Keyes. And we may never know all of it because he made it much harder to know. He took some of those secrets to his grave, deliberately, as one final act of control. Stay with me, because this story is unlike any other in the history of American violent crime. And the man at the center of it is unlike any killer you have heard of before. Not because of the scale of what he did, because of the method, because of the mind. because of what it means that a person like this existed, walked among us, and almost never got caught. Israel Keyes was born on January 7, 1978, in Richmond, Utah. He was the second of 10 children born to John and Heidi Keyes, a deeply religious family that followed a sect of the Christian identity movement, an extremist ideology built around white supremacist beliefs wrapped in the language of Scripture. The Keyes family lived an isolated life, deliberately removed from mainstream society, homeschooled, rural, self-sufficient in the way that families who distrust the outside world tend to be. They moved eventually to the Pacific Northwest, to a remote area of Washington state, where the children were raised in dense forest, learning to hunt and track and live off the land. It was a childhood of genuine wilderness skills, of independence and self-reliance and physical competence. The children were capable in ways that most children raised in suburban America are not. They could navigate the woods. They could read weather and track animals. They could be alone in remote environments, without fear or disorientation. What went wrong inside Israel Keyes during those years is something that investigators, psychologists, and behavioral scientists spent years trying to understand, and something that even now, more than a decade after his death, remains only partially visible. He was not, by the accounts of those who knew him in childhood, visibly disturbed. He was quiet. He was capable. He was sometimes distant, sometimes intensely focused, sometimes withdrawn in ways that could have been attributed to introversion or to the particular isolation of his upbringing. He had his first contact with the law as a teenager, a relatively minor incident that gave investigators no reason to flag him for future attention. He left home in the mid-1990s, eventually enlisting in the United States Army in 1998. He served until 2001, including a deployment to Egypt as part of a peacekeeping mission. He was described by those who served with him as competent, disciplined, and somewhat solitary. He did his job. He drew no particular attention. After leaving the Army, he made his way to Alaska. He settled in Anchorage and started a construction business, working as a contractor in the way that many tradespeople do in Alaska: seasonal, intense, skilled. He had a daughter with a woman he was in a relationship with. He was, by all external appearances, building an adult life. He was also studying. Israel Keyes read extensively about serial killers, not in the casual true crime interest way that millions of people do. He read analytically, the way a person reads a field manual. He studied how they were caught. He identified the patterns that had made Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy and Gary Ridgway vulnerable to investigation. He noted the mistakes they had made, the connections they had failed to break, the victim selections that had created geographic profiles pointing back to them, the personal relationships that had provided investigators with motives and opportunities. He was not interested in emulating them. He was interested in not being caught the way they were caught. He was building, in his own mind, a model of the operationally perfect predator, a person who existed in total separation from his crimes, a person who left no trail. He believed he had figured out how to do it. The first thing he would need was separation, geographic separation. If he committed crimes in Alaska, where he lived and worked and was known, the investigation would eventually circle back to him. The solution was simple. Do not commit crimes where you live. Travel. Go somewhere with no connection to your life. Select victims with no connection to you. Leave nothing behind. The second thing he would need was preparation. If he drove to a location and bought supplies locally, those purchases could be traced. The solution was equally simple. Buy the supplies years in advance. Bury them. Let the evidence go cold. Let the time between acquisition and use become so long that no investigator could reasonably connect them. He started burying caches sometime around 2001. He would travel to remote areas of the United States, dig a hole, and bury a waterproof container filled with what he needed: cash, weapons, restraints, basic supplies. Sometimes he buried multiple caches in a single region. Sometimes he visited a region only once, leaving a single buried kit for a crime that might be years away. He was patient. He had always been patient. Patience for Israel Keyes was not a virtue. It was a weapon. The full scope of Israel Keys's criminal history is not known. It may never be fully known. That appears to have been his intention. 3 victims are confirmed by name: Samantha Koenig in Alaska and William and Lorraine Currier in Vermont. Keys also gave investigators reason to believe there were additional victims, and FBI investigators later suspected the total number may have been around 11 or possibly more. He never provided a complete list. He used this information as leverage in his conversations with investigators, always controlling what he gave them, always ensuring that he kept enough to himself to maintain a position of power even from a jail cell. What investigators do know is that his criminal activity began long before his most documented crimes. He committed burglaries, many of them, across the Pacific Northwest and Alaska and other parts of the country. The burglaries served multiple purposes. They generated cash, which he needed to fund his travels and his caches without leaving a financial trail. They allowed him to practice the skills that his larger crimes would require: bypassing locks, moving through spaces without leaving trace evidence, operating in the darkness of other people's homes without detection. He was, from the beginning, systematic. He did not burglarize neighborhoods where he lived. He targeted areas where he had no connection, where his face was not known, where his vehicle was not recognized. He was careful with what he touched and what he left behind. He was learning, refining, building a set of skills that most criminals never develop, because most criminals do not think in terms of systems. Investigators believe his serious violent crimes may have begun years before his confirmed murders. The first confirmed killings by name were William and Lorraine Currier, a married couple in Essex, Vermont, whom Keys murdered in June 2011 after breaking into their home. But investigators believe the Currier murders were not the beginning. They believe the timeline extends further back, into the 2000s, into years of criminal activity that remains largely undocumented because Keys designed it that way. What he did in Vermont tells us much about the method as it existed in its mature form by 2011. He had flown from Alaska to Chicago. He had rented a car in Chicago. He had driven more than 1,000 miles to Vermont, a state with no connection to his life, no connection to any previous crime he was associated with, no reason for investigators to look there for a killer from Alaska. He had broken into the Currier home in the night. He had murdered William and Lorraine Currier. He disposed of their bodies at an abandoned farmhouse site that would later be demolished, leaving investigators without recoverable remains. He had then driven back to Chicago, returned the rental car, and flown home to Anchorage. He went back to his construction business. He went back to his daughter. He went back to his ordinary life. Nobody in Alaska had any idea where he had been. Nobody in Vermont had any idea who had killed the Curriers. The case sat in the Vermont State Police files as an unsolved homicide, with no identified suspect and no geographic profile pointing anywhere useful. That was exactly what Israel Keys had intended. To fully understand what Israel Keys built, you have to set aside the way you usually think about violent crime. You have to set aside the profile of the disorganized, impulsive, emotionally driven offender. You have to set aside even the organized offender that behavioral science describes, the meticulous planner who selects specific victim types and follows a consistent geographic pattern. Israel Keys does not fit neatly into either category because he had read the same behavioral science literature as the investigators and had deliberately designed himself to fall outside it. He called what he did compartmentalization. In his interviews with FBI Special Agent Jolene Gooden and the other investigators who worked his case, he described the way he kept his criminal life and his ordinary life in completely separate mental spaces. He was not haunted by what he did. He was not distracted by it. He did not lose sleep. He did not drink excessively or behave erratically or display the kind of psychological stress that often makes killers visible in their communities. He simply separated. When he was in Alaska, being a contractor and a father, that was who he was. When he was on a plane heading toward a buried cache in rural America, that was a different mode. Different person, almost. Different rules. The caches were a masterpiece of long-term planning. Investigators eventually found or identified multiple cache locations across the United States, in areas as geographically diverse as New York State, Texas, Washington State, and the Pacific Northwest. Each cache represented a future crime that Keyes had already, in some sense, committed in his mind. He had selected the region. He had buried the supplies. He had done the advance work. The actual crime, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. The preparation was the real investment. This approach had a profound implication for forensic investigation. When law enforcement investigates a homicide, one of the first questions is always about the evidence trail. Where did the supplies come from? Where was the weapon purchased? Can we trace the rope, the restraints, the tape? In a normal investigation, these questions often yield results. Purchases leave records. Records can be traced. In an Israel Keyes case, those questions led nowhere. The supplies had been purchased years earlier, in cash, in locations with no connection to the crime. The weapon had been buried in the ground for years before it was used. There was no purchase trail because the trail had gone completely cold before the crime even occurred. He also used an additional layer of protection that investigators found genuinely chilling. He would sometimes select a victim's home in advance, case it carefully, note all the details he needed, and then not return for months. He was testing his own discipline. He was asking himself whether he could resist the compulsion, whether he could walk away from a selected target and come back later on his own schedule, rather than being driven by urgency or emotion. He could, he always could. He was in complete control of himself. Always. And that control was the most dangerous thing about him. February 1st, 2012 was a Wednesday. In Anchorage, Alaska, in February, that means darkness. Real, pressing, early falling darkness that arrives by mid-afternoon and does not lift until well into the next morning. It means cold that is not the romantic cold of a winter postcard, but the functional, serious cold of a subarctic city where people dress for survival and not for aesthetics. Samantha Koenig was 18 years old. She worked at a drive-through coffee kiosk called Common Grounds, a small standalone structure in a parking lot on Tudor Road in Anchorage. It was in the winter a solitary kind of job. A small, warm box in the dark and the cold, a window, a steady stream of customers in cars who wanted their coffee and their brief human contact and then drove away. Samantha was scheduled to close the kiosk alone that evening. She was a young woman with the particular brightness that people who knew her consistently described. Energetic, funny, full of plans. She had a boyfriend, she had friends. She had a life that was, at 18, still mostly in front of her. Israel Keyes had been watching the kiosk. He had noted the hours. He had noted that a young woman worked there alone in the evenings. He had observed the closing routine. He had, in the methodical way that was the foundation of everything he did, built a picture of the vulnerability before he ever approached it. He came to the kiosk that evening after the last customer had gone. He was wearing dark clothing. He had a gun. He approached the window and then came around to the door. Samantha Koenig, working alone in a small box in a dark parking lot in the Alaskan winter, had no warning and no chance. He took her. He drove her to his home. He restrained her in a shed on his property. And then, in the following hours, Israel Keyes did something that was a profound and fatal departure from every principle he had ever built his criminal life upon. He decided to try to profit from the abduction. He decided to collect a ransom. That decision cost him everything. Samantha Koenig was reported missing almost immediately. She had not come home. The kiosk had been found unlocked and empty at closing time, her belongings still inside. Anchorage police began investigating what appeared to be an abduction. The surveillance cameras in the area of the coffee kiosk were reviewed. Footage from a nearby business showed a man approaching the kiosk. It showed him leaving. It showed him leaving with Samantha Koenig. The investigation was active, intense, and frightening. A young woman was missing. The circumstances suggested violence. There was a suspect on surveillance video and nothing else to go on. And then, approximately 2 weeks after the abduction, Samantha's family received a ransom demand. The demand was for $30,000. It was to be paid through a series of ATM withdrawals using Samantha's debit card across multiple locations. The demand arrived after Samantha was already dead. Keyes murdered her soon after the abduction, then used the illusion that she was alive as part of the ransom scheme. He had then staged her body, taken a photograph designed to make her appear alive, and mailed a note to her family that included the photograph as proof of life. The photograph was disturbing in its coldness. He had propped the body, added a newspaper to include a visible date, and created what he believed would be sufficient evidence that Samantha was still alive. He then left Alaska on a pre-planned trip that took him through New Orleans and onto a cruise with family. He needed to be somewhere else, somewhere with an alibi, somewhere that placed him far from Alaska while the ransom demand was processed and the withdrawals were made. He had set the scheme up to run without him physically present, using Samantha's card remotely through a system that he believed left no trail back to him. This was the critical error. Not the murder, the ransom scheme. Israel Keyes had built his criminal career on one unbreakable principle: do not profit from your crimes in any traceable way. Do not use victim property. Do not create a financial connection between yourself and a crime. Do not introduce money into the equation because money leaves tracks. He broke that principle with the ransom. He needed money. He was behind on bills. His construction business had been struggling. The need was real and practical, and it overrode the discipline that had protected him for over a decade. One need. One broken rule. One thread. Investigators began tracing the debit card withdrawals. They tracked the transactions across multiple states as Keyes, now back from New Orleans and moving around the country, used the card at ATMs in different cities. Each ATM had a camera. Each camera had footage. Footage meant images. Images meant a face. The face on the ATM footage was the same face that had appeared on the surveillance video near the Common Grounds kiosk on the night Samantha Koenig disappeared. Investigators traced the card usage to Texas. A license plate near one of the ATM transactions was identified. The plate was registered to a rental car. The rental car had been rented in Texas by a man traveling from Alaska. His name was Israel Keyes. On March 13, 2012, approximately 6 weeks after Samantha Koenig's abduction, Israel Keyes was pulled over in a traffic stop in Lufkin, Texas. He was driving a rental car. He had Samantha Koenig's debit card in his possession. He was arrested. The man who had spent over a decade being invisible was sitting in the back of a police vehicle in East Texas, arrested in a state he had only visited because he was using a murder victim's bank card. One mistake. One broken rule. Everything unraveled. Before this story moves into the investigation and the confession and the years of FBI interviews that followed, I need to stop. The way I always stop in these stories, because this one is not about Israel Keyes.
Not really.
This one is about Samantha Koenig. She was 18 years old. She had dark hair and an easy smile, and the kind of energy that people who loved her consistently struggled to describe because the words for it are always slightly insufficient. She was funny. She was warm. She liked music. She had plans. She went to work on a cold February evening to close a coffee kiosk in Anchorage, Alaska, and she never came home. Her family, her father James Koenig in particular, lived through one of the most agonizing experiences that a parent can endure. Not just the loss, devastating as that is, but the period before the loss was confirmed, the weeks during which the ransom demand made them believe that Samantha might still be alive, that if they cooperated, if they did everything they were asked, their daughter might come home. She was already gone when those letters arrived. She had already been murdered. The ransom demand, the photographs staged to look like proof of life, the entire scheme was constructed over a corpse. James Koenig was asked to grieve and hope simultaneously, and the hope was a lie manufactured by the man who had already taken everything. That particular cruelty, layered on top of everything else, is the detail that stays. Israel Keyes was meticulous about so many things. He planned for years. He buried caches and traveled under false patterns and built a system of invisibility so comprehensive that it took over a decade to crack. And in the middle of all that architecture of control, he found the time to send a dead girl's father a staged photograph and a ransom demand, just to keep the scheme running a little longer. That is who Israel Keyes was. That is what all the methods served. Samantha Koenig's remains were recovered from Matanuska Lake in early April 2012, after Keyes, in custody, gave investigators enough information to locate them. She deserved better than that. She deserved decades more of her own life. She deserved everything that a person of her warmth and energy and youth was building toward. Remember her. When Israel Keyes was brought into custody in March of 2012 and transferred back to Anchorage, Alaska, the FBI had a problem that was simultaneously straightforward and extraordinarily complex. They had a man in custody who they suspected was responsible for far more than the kidnapping and murder of Samantha Koenig. The ransom scheme, the methodical use of the debit card, the geographic pattern of the card usage, all of it pointed to someone who was organized, experienced, and who had done this before. The behavioral science team at the FBI reviewed what they knew about Israel Keyes and came to a conclusion that led them to approach the interviews with unusual care. This was not a man you caught by accident and who would fall apart in the interview room. This was a man who had designed himself to be uncatchable, who understood investigation, who had studied law enforcement methodology, and who would need to be engaged on his own terms if investigators were going to learn anything beyond the Koenig case. FBI Special Agent Yolene Gooden led the interview effort. She approached Keyes with a combination of respect, patience, and strategic intelligence that the situation demanded. She did not treat him as a broken man. She treated him as an intelligent adversary who had agreed, for his own reasons, to talk. She met him where he was, allowed the conversation to develop on his terms within limits, and listened. He wanted to talk. That much became clear almost immediately. But he wanted to talk on his own terms. He would share information about his method, about his planning, about his approach to crime, and he would confirm murders when investigators presented evidence he could not plausibly deny. But he would not give up everything. He would not give up victim identities he had chosen to conceal. He would not give up cache locations he had decided to keep. He would not give up the full timeline of his crimes. He would give what he decided to give, and not one piece more. He was in a jail cell. He was facing multiple murder charges. He had no practical leverage left in any ordinary sense of the word. And yet he managed to conduct himself in those interviews as though he were still partially in control of the outcome, still capable of determining what investigators would and would not learn. That control was real. It was not an illusion. Because he had information investigators desperately needed. Information about other victims, about other crimes, about cache locations that might still contain evidence, or that might be linked to unsolved murders across the country. And he was willing to release that information only according to his own internal schedule, as a drip rather than a flood, on his own terms. The investigators sat across from him and listened. They asked questions. They followed the threads he offered. They built the picture piece by piece, from what he chose to share, knowing that the full picture existed and that he had chosen to leave significant portions of it permanently dark. The interviews went on for months. Israel Keyes told the FBI investigators a great deal, enough to confirm 3 named murder victims and to show why investigators suspected more victims across multiple states and more than a decade, enough to identify the locations of several cache sites, enough to understand, in broad terms, the geographic reach of his crimes and the operational method he had used to commit and conceal them. He confirmed the murders of William and Lorraine Currier in Vermont in 2011, giving investigators enough detail to establish responsibility even though their remains were not recovered. He described the planning that had preceded the crime, the flight from Alaska, the rented car, the long drive, the burial kit that he had placed in the area years before. He described the murders with a precision that investigators found both useful and deeply unsettling. He was not distressed by the recounting. He was organized, structured, presenting information the way a contractor might review a completed project. He told them about the caches, not all of them. He revealed some locations, allowed investigators to excavate and find the buried containers, confirmed their contents. He described others in terms general enough to orient investigators without giving them exact coordinates. He was calibrating constantly, giving enough to stay credible, holding back enough to maintain his position. He told them about his victim selection method. He did not target specific people. He targeted conditions. A house where someone appeared to be alone. A situation where the level of risk seemed manageable. He did not choose victims because of who they were. He chose them because of where they were and what their circumstances made possible. That randomness, he explained, was a deliberate operational choice. Targeted victims have connections to the killer. Random victims have no connection. No connection means no investigation pointing back to him. He told them about his philosophy of geographic separation. He never committed crimes near his home. He never returned to the same region twice in a short time frame. He traveled to diverse locations across the country, rotating through areas in ways that prevented investigators from developing a coherent geographic profile of his crimes. He told them about possible other murders, the ones beyond the Couriers and Samantha Koenig. He was less specific about these. He suggested or admitted enough for investigators to take the possibility seriously. He sometimes provided partial information, a state, a year, a general description, enough to suggest the scale without providing the specifics that would allow cases to be closed. He was, even in his partial disclosures, exercising control. And he told them something that stopped the room. He told them that he had been watching a family in Alaska, that he had selected them, that he had been in their home while they slept, and that he had decided, for reasons he described only partially, not to kill them. He left the house, he went home, he moved on. There was a family in Alaska who did not know they had been selected by Israel Keys, who did not know he had been in their home, who had never received any indication that the man who was now sitting in a federal detention facility, confessing to murders across multiple states, had once stood in their house in the dark while they slept and decided to let them live. Investigators in that room had to absorb that information and keep working. That is the job. That is what the job requires. You absorb the information and you keep working, because there is a man across the table who knows things you need to know. You keep working. One of the most painful dimensions of the Israel Keys investigation was the geography of the unknown. He had confirmed 3 named victims and left investigators with evidence and statements suggesting more. Investigators believed, based on his own statements and on the evidence of the caches and the travel patterns they were able to reconstruct, that the actual number was higher, possibly significantly higher. He had cache sites whose locations he declined to confirm. He had spoken, in oblique terms, about crimes in specific states that investigators could not connect to known cases. He had described victim types and situations that matched unsolved homicides in multiple parts of the country without confirming or denying specific cases. He was giving investigators the shape of a larger crime history without filling in the details that would allow them to close cases or provide families with answers. The families of missing and murdered persons across the United States were waiting. Investigators working cold cases in Vermont and Texas and Washington and New York and other states were watching the Keys investigation closely, wondering if the crimes that had haunted their files for years might be connected to the man now talking to the FBI in Anchorage. Keys knew they were watching. He knew the weight of what he was withholding, and he chose to withhold it. He framed this choice in conversations with investigators as a form of protection for his daughter. He did not want her to grow up knowing the full scope of what her father had done. He wanted to control the narrative, to limit what became public, to ensure that the worst of what he was remained in the dark even after he was gone. Whether this motivation was genuine, or whether it was simply another expression of his fundamental need to maintain control of information, investigators were never entirely certain. What they were certain of was the result. There are people whose disappearances remain unexplained. There are families who have waited years for answers, and in some cases investigators have had to consider the possibility that Keys knew more than he ever revealed. There are cold cases in law enforcement files across the country that may be connected to Israel Keys and that, without his cooperation, may never be conclusively closed. That is his final act of control. The silence he built into the end of the story as carefully as he built everything else. He planned his death the way he planned everything else. With discipline, with method, with an eye toward the outcome he wanted. Israel Keyes was found dead in his cell at the Anchorage Correctional Complex on December 2, 2012. He had used a razor to cut his wrists. He had written, in his own blood, on the walls of his cell and on paper. The writings were a mixture of poetry, biographical notes, and statements that investigators and analysts spent years trying to fully interpret. He was 34 years old. He had been in custody for 9 months. He had given investigators significant information across those 9 months, enough to confirm the Koenig and Currier murders and to give the FBI a disturbing portrait of a highly mobile, highly organized offender. And he had withheld enough to ensure that the portrait would always be incomplete. His death was, in the judgment of virtually everyone who worked the case, the final calculated act of a man who controlled everything he could control until the last possible moment. He chose the timing. He chose the method. He chose what he left behind and what he took with him. The investigation into his crimes did not end with his death. The FBI continued to work the case for years, analyzing the information he had provided, attempting to match it against unsolved homicides across the country, excavating cache sites he had identified, and others they located through independent investigation. The geographic and behavioral picture they built from his interviews and from the physical evidence they recovered remains one of the most comprehensive studies of organized criminal methodology in the history of the Bureau. Investigators connected his confirmed murder victims to Alaska and Vermont, while also examining crimes, travel, and caches in other states, including New York, Washington, Texas, and the Pacific Northwest. They identified caches in other states. They developed information suggesting crimes in additional regions that were never confirmed during the investigation. The cold case connections remain active areas of inquiry in law enforcement files across multiple jurisdictions. He indicated that his violent crimes spanned years, and investigators examined a timeline reaching back into the early 2000s. He had described, without confirming, a larger number of victims than the 11 he admitted to. He had spoken about crimes in geographic areas that suggested a reach across the continental United States. And then he had stopped talking about it, permanently on December 2, 2012. Whatever he took with him that night, he took deliberately. The Israel Keyes investigation produced, as a byproduct of its horror, one of the most instructive case studies in the history of serial crime analysis. The case became important to behavioral analysts and investigators because it challenged several assumptions often used when linking organized serial offenders. The first assumption Keyes challenged was the idea of victim-type consistency. Behavioral science had long established that most serial killers are identifiable partly because they return, compulsively and consistently, to the same type of victim. The same age range, the same gender, the same physical appearance, the same social vulnerability. That consistency creates a profile. That profile creates an investigative target. Keyes selected victims based on opportunity and conditions, not on type. His victims ranged in age from young to middle-aged. They were of different genders and different social situations. The only consistent factor was that they were, in his assessment at the time of selection, accessible and isolated. That consistency was too broad to create a useful forensic profile. He had read the behavioral science and had structured his selection to fall outside its predictive range. The second assumption he challenged was geographic signature. Serial killers typically develop a comfort zone, a geographic area where they operate, that reflects their daily movements, their knowledge of the terrain, their psychological sense of safety. Investigators use geographic profiling to identify where a serial killer likely lives based on the distribution of their crimes. The method is well established and has solved numerous cases. Keyes committed crimes in states thousands of miles from his home, deliberately rotating through locations to prevent any geographic profile from emerging. His crimes in Vermont pointed to New England. His crimes in Alaska pointed to the Pacific Northwest. His cache sites pointed in different directions again. Any geographic profile built from his known crimes would have generated a map of the entire continental United States, which is no profile at all. The third, and perhaps most consequential thing Keyes challenged, was the assumption that time connects crimes to criminals. The standard investigative principle is that recent crimes have the freshest evidence, the most traceable connections, the best chance of yielding a lead. Keyes deliberately introduced extreme time delays between his preparation and his crimes. He buried supplies years before he used them, creating a gap so wide that any evidence from the preparation was long cold before the crime occurred. He had, in the assessment of the FBI agents who studied him most carefully, engineered his crimes to be resistant to the standard investigative toolkit at every point of potential vulnerability. He had not done this perfectly, as the Samantha Koenig case ultimately proved, but he had done it well enough to evade detection for over a decade, well enough that the full scope of his crimes will likely never be known, well enough that he forced law enforcement to reckon with a class of offender for which the existing framework was genuinely insufficient. He forced them to think differently, even from a jail cell, even in death. That was the final thing about Israel Keyes that was impossible to dismiss. William and Lorraine Currier were a married couple living in Essex, Vermont, when Israel Keyes came to their neighborhood in June 2011. They lived in a quiet house in a quiet suburb of Burlington, and they were, by every account of the people who loved them, a couple who had built something good together. Bill Currier was 59 years old. He had a kindness about him that his friends remembered in specific terms, not as a generic quality, but as something they had experienced directly. In moments where he had gone out of his way for someone without expecting anything in return. Lorraine was 55. She was sharp and warm and funny in the way of people who are genuinely comfortable with themselves. They had no children. They had each other and a life they had made together, and a community of friends and family who valued them. Israel Keyes had no idea who they were. He had flown to Chicago, rented a car, driven to Vermont, and walked through their neighborhood looking for the right conditions, the right house, the right situation. He selected them because of where they lived, and when their lights were on, and what their street looked like at the time he was passing through. He did not know their names until he was inside their house. The Curriers were reported missing shortly after the crime. Vermont State Police investigated. They found no bodies, no clear crime scene, no forensic trail leading to a suspect. The case went cold. The investigation continued in the background, as cold case investigations do, with periodic activity and long stretches of quiet, while the people who loved Bill and Lorraine waited for an answer that did not come. The answer came in 2012, when Israel Keyes, in custody in Alaska, confirmed that he had killed them. He described the crime in the terms investigators recognized as accurate, matching detail to evidence in ways that only the perpetrator could have known. He identified the abandoned farmhouse connected to the crime, but by then the site had been demolished, and their remains were not recovered. Lorraine's sister, who had spent a year not knowing what had happened, and then had spent the subsequent years processing an answer that was, in some ways, harder than the not knowing, has spoken publicly about what the Keyes case meant to her family. The confirmation was not closure. Closure is a word that people who have not experienced this kind of loss sometimes apply to it because they need to believe that an answer resolves the grief. It does not. The answer simply gives the grief a specific shape. Bill and Lorraine Currier were not chosen. They were not targeted. They were not connected to Israel Keyes by any thread of relationship or conflict or history. They were simply home on the wrong night. That randomness, the pure and terrible randomness of it, is something that the people who love them have had to find a way to live with. There is no way to make sense of randomness. You can only survive it. Somewhere in the United States, there are families who do not know that Israel Keyes is the answer to their question. They have been asking the question for years. some of them for over a decade. They have a missing person, or a homicide victim, or a cold case that has sat in a file with the word unsolved attached to it, and that has never moved toward resolution because there was never a thread long enough to pull. Israel Keyes may be their thread. He may be the connection that, if confirmed, would give them what they have been waiting for. But confirmation requires information that Keyes chose not to provide. And Keyes is dead, and the information he withheld died with him. The FBI has worked for years to match Keyes's confirmed behavioral patterns against unsolved cases across the country. The analysis is ongoing. In some cases, investigators have developed strong circumstantial connections between Keyes's known travel patterns, his cache locations, and specific unsolved homicides. Those connections have not produced the kind of definitive confirmation that would allow a case to be officially closed and a family to be officially told. In some cases, investigators have considered possible additional victims but have been unable to gather enough evidence for official confirmation. Those cases remain in the uncomfortable territory of probable but unconfirmed, which is a particular cruelty for the families involved. To be told that your loved one was probably murdered by a man who is now dead, that investigators believe it but cannot prove it, that there will likely never be a public confirmation, is a specific kind of unresolution that has no good name. This is the legacy that Israel Keyes designed for himself, not just the confirmed crimes, as devastating as they are. The uncertainty, the open cases, the families still waiting, the investigators still working files that may never fully close. He built that incompleteness into the architecture of his crimes the way he built everything deliberately, as a form of control that would outlast his own life. He is gone. The control remains. That is the final and most chilling thing about Israel Keyes. In the years since Israel Keyes' death, his case has become a reference point in law enforcement, in academic criminology, and in the broader cultural conversation about violent crime. Not because he was the most prolific serial killer in American history. He was not. Not because his crimes were the most violent. They were not uniquely so. But because of what his method revealed about the assumptions that investigators bring to the task of finding people who do not want to be found. He revealed that the standard forensic toolkit, built over decades and refined through hundreds of cases, had a gap that could be exploited by someone intelligent enough to identify it, patient enough to plan around it, and disciplined enough to maintain the planning over an extended period of time. He identified that gap through his own reading, through his study of how other killers had been caught, and he designed his operations to fall outside it. The lesson for law enforcement is an uncomfortable one. The methods that caught Israel Keyes worked because he broke his own rules. He was caught by a mistake he made, not by a gap in his system. If he had not needed money, if he had not used Samantha Koenig's debit card, if he had maintained the financial discipline that had characterized everything else he did. The traffic stop in Lufkin, Texas does not happen. The interview in Anchorage does not happen. The confessions do not happen. He is still out there, still operating, still buried in the gap between what forensic investigation can reach and what a sufficiently disciplined criminal can place outside its grasp. That is an uncomfortable truth, but it is a true one. And the lesson it contains for law enforcement, for forensic science, for the behavioral scientists who build the profiles that guide investigations, is that the discipline required to be Israel Keyes is extremely rare. That rarity is not nothing. It means that the system fails only against the most exceptional adversaries, and that exceptional adversaries are, by definition, uncommon. But they exist. Keyes proved it. And the existence of one proves the possibility of others. The FBI is thinking about those others. They have been thinking about them since December 2nd, 2012. Israel Keyes had a daughter. He had raised her, alongside her mother, during the same years he was planning murders and burying caches and flying across the country to commit crimes. She was a child in Anchorage, growing up with a father who went on work trips sometimes, who came home and was present and attentive, in the way that her experience of him suggested he should be. She was a teenager when her father was arrested. She was a teenager when the news broke that the man she knew as her father was a serial killer. She was a teenager when the FBI interviews began and the confessions accumulated, and the scope of what Israel Keyes had done became gradually and then all at once public knowledge. Her name has been protected. The FBI and prosecutors in the case made a deliberate and compassionate decision to keep her identity out of the public record to the greatest extent possible. She did not choose her father. She did not know what her father was. She is entitled to build her own life without the weight of his name following her into every room. Keyes himself, in his interviews, expressed concern about her. It was one of the few genuinely emotional threads in the conversations, the places where something that looked like feeling broke through the clinical surface of his self-presentation. Whether the emotion was genuine, or whether it was another form of image management, another way of presenting himself as a person who had something worth protecting, investigators were divided. What is not in doubt is that a child lost her father to a jail cell and then to death, that she has had to grow up carrying a knowledge that most people are never asked to carry, that she is, whatever the facts of her origins, a person who deserves the same right as anyone else to determine who she is on her own terms. She is not her father. Children are not their parents. That truth requires saying even when it is obvious, because in cases like this, the obvious is sometimes the first thing the world forgets. FBI Special Agent Jolene Guidon spent months in a room with Israel Keyes. She listened to him describe murders with the equanimity of a man describing carpentry projects. She navigated the game of partial disclosure and strategic withholding that he conducted with careful consistency. She stayed professional, patient, and sharp across dozens of interview sessions with a man who was simultaneously cooperative and controlling, who was giving her information and managing what she's received with a precision that never fully relaxed. She has spoken publicly about the Keyes case in the years since his death, providing insight into the investigation that has become invaluable for both law enforcement training and public understanding of how the case unfolded. She has described the experience of sitting across from Keyes with a combination of professional respect and clear-eyed honesty about what the work required. The work required her to treat a man who had murdered 3 confirmed victims and possible additional victims as a credible, intelligent source of information that she needed. To put aside, in the professional space of the interview room, the human reaction to what he was describing, and to focus on what he was telling her, on the operational details that would help close cases and potentially connect crimes. To be strategic about what she asked and how she asked it, knowing that a misstep might cause him to close a door she might not be able to reopen. That is not the kind of work that shows on a resume in any way that communicates what it actually costs. It is quiet, persistent, deeply skilled work that unfolds in a small room between 2 people, one of whom has decided to talk, and one of whom has to listen and respond in exactly the right way to keep the conversation going. Jolene Guidon kept the conversation going for months. What she extracted from those months is the foundation of everything law enforcement knows about Israel Keyes. Without her work, the case would have been a single homicide in Alaska with a tragic victim and a defendant who died in custody before trial. Because of her work, it became a documented record of one of the most methodically constructed criminal careers in American history. That record matters. Not to glorify what Keyes did, to understand it well enough to be prepared the next time. There is a particular kind of grief that attaches to the open case. The case where someone you love is gone, and you know they are gone. And you know roughly what happened, but you do not have the full picture. You have the shape of the answer without the details. You have confirmation of the worst without the specific knowledge that would allow you to build a complete count of the last hours. The families connected to Israel Keyes' crimes live in different positions along that spectrum. Some of them, like the Courier family, have confirmation. They know who did it. They know roughly how. They have had the terrible gift of a definitive answer. They carry grief, enormous grief, but they carry it with a name attached to it, which is different from carrying it without one. Others are still waiting, still in the position of knowing that their person is gone, and suspecting in some cases that Keyes is connected, and being unable to receive the confirmation that would allow them to move from suspicion to knowledge. They are waiting for an answer that may never come because the man who had it decided not to share it. That deliberate withholding is, in the end, the thing about Israel Keyes that sits heaviest, not the murders themselves, as monstrous as they were. The choice, the conscious, calculated, deliberate choice to carry certain information to his grave and to use that information as a form of power even after he was no longer capable of exercising power in any other way. He was good at power. He had always been good at it. He had exercised it over the conditions of his crimes for over a decade, controlling every variable, managing every risk. When the variables of his freedom were removed, he continued to exercise it over information. It was the last domain available to him. He used it until the end. Samantha Koenig was 18 years old. She closed a coffee kiosk on a cold February night in Anchorage, Alaska, and she never came home. William and Lorraine Currier were home on a June evening in Vermont when a man who had driven from Chicago arrived and destroyed everything. The other victims, the ones we know about and the ones we do not, were living their lives in the way that people live their lives when they have no reason to expect the worst. Israel Keyes gave them reason. He did it methodically, patiently, across more than a decade in multiple states, to people who had no connection to him and who had given him no cause. He did it because he had decided to do it, planned how to do it, buried the tools for doing it, and flown himself to where those tools were waiting. He was caught because he needed money and used dead girl's bank card, and because a camera at an ATM in Texas captured his face, and because a rental car company had a record, and because the thread, once pulled, unraveled with a speed that his decade of careful construction had not been able to prevent. One mistake, one thread, one traffic stop in East Texas. That is how it ended for the man who had spent years making himself impossible to find. Not through one clean behavioral profile or one brilliant forensic breakthrough, but through the money trail he created, the surveillance it generated, and the ordinary records he failed to avoid. Through one mistake, one broken rule, one moment when the discipline failed because the need was greater than the system. The lesson is not entirely comfortable. The lesson says that the system did not catch Israel Keyes. Keyes caught himself. And the question that law enforcement has been working with ever since is what happens the next time a person with his discipline and his method and his patience decides to do what he did and does not make the mistake. The answer to that question is still being written. The forensic science is evolving. The investigative methods are changing. The databases are growing. The digital trails that were invisible in 2001 are increasingly visible in 2024. And the tools that solved cases through genealogical DNA, digital records, license plate data, bank card trails, and forensic databases suggest that the gap Keyes exploited is narrowing. It has not closed, not fully, not yet. But the people working to close it are patient too. They are methodical too, and they are not going to stop. Samantha Koenig deserved to close that kiosk and drive home. Bill and Lorraine Currier deserved a quiet evening with the lights on. The ones we do not yet know deserved every ordinary day they did not get. Remember them.